Interesting. So when you get to the CD versus, say, Blu-ray or DVD audio, and there's people that'll argue all day long that say that you can't hear the difference between a CD 16-bit and a 24-bit. And I disagree. I think you can hear the difference, but I'm not so sure if it's a lot of times if it's how it was mastered. What is your take on why are we still stuck with why are we still stuck with 16-bit CDs when we could have been playing DVDs or Blu-ray audio discs for the last 20 years, 15 years? We could have been gone with the CD, but we're still making them. We're still putting them on CD. Do you have any insight into that? Why are we still stuck with this format?
It's we have the format wars to thank for this. It has nothing to do with audio. It has to do with marketing and manufacturing and costs. And this goes all the way back. I mean, I teach this in my class. This goes all the way back to the very first format. You know, in the very first format, we had cylinder versus disc platter. And what was better? Well, cylinder, you could have various lengths, so your length of program could vary, and so you just increase the size of the tube of the cylinder. You had constant rotation at an exact same circumference all the way around, so it was never a speed change throughout. You had linear tracking of your needle. You didn't have these angles, and all of this was great. But what's the problem with it? Well, manufacturing. You got a cylinder, very hard to manufacture. How do you ship it? You have to have these rectangular crates to ship them in. You had manufacturing issues. You had various lengths. You had shipping cost concerns. What's your competitor? A platter. So okay, what do? It's simple. It's easy to cut. Who cares if it gets slower as you go in because the circumference is getting smaller and smaller. The angle of the needle changes, so the color may change a little bit as you're going in. You know, the dynamic range may have to change a little bit. But what's good about it? Stamp them out. 1, 2, 3. You didn't have to cut them individually like you do cylinders. You were able to. They're basically two-dimensional. In a sleeve, pack them up, stack them in a crate. Shipping costs are down. Manufacturing costs are down. All this stuff. It's inferior audibly, but guess what? It won the war. That was the first format war. And here's a curious thing about it. Today, what that has been left over since that time, what is radio single length?
3-4 minutes, right?
3.5 minutes. And guess where that came from?
The record.
Your 10-inch 78 shellac disc. It's as much as it could hold back then, and ever since that time period, that has been the radio standard. Radio cut, radio edit is usually 3 to 3.5 minutes, no longer. It's just, and this is it, the formats have been going on. We were there for the format between, when we went from CD, consumer side, when we went from CD manufacturing, and then all of a sudden, SACD with DSD came out, it was like godsend. It sounded so amazing. And your competitor, DVD audio. What was great about it? It was still PCM based. You could play it still in your CDs. You know, we didn't have SACD hybrid quite yet. You could play it in your CD players. It was still PCM based. And more importantly, it was also related to actual DVD video. So you could have DVD audio and video, and everybody had a DVD player, but they didn't all have an SACD player.
Right.
So it just, you know, eventually SACD, it lost that format. But in the end, when streaming came in, everyone was just like, why am I buying any of this stuff? You know, streaming and the convenience of MP3, you know, now we've lost... Unfortunately, we're coming up on 2 generations now that really truly understand what high fidelity or even CD wave fidelity sounds like.
Yeah, now we're starting to see, of course, you know, over the past 10, 15 years, records have come back somewhat. We're not still at the 1978 peak, but people are now buying CDs more from what I'm seeing. When it comes to 16-bit and 24-bit, this kind of stirred up a controversy on the video I had with Simon, because people are saying, he was saying basically he always takes his stuff, even if he gets it in 16-bit, he puts it in 24-bit. He does his recording. For example, if someone sends him tracks, he puts his drum track down. He'll do it in 24-bit. then he'll have to bring it back down, of course, and send it back to the person. And he says he believes it still sounds better. Other people are like, simply not true, impossible. As soon as he brings it back to 16-bit, what he did in 24-bit has no relevance. What is your take on all of this?
No, it's definitely relevant because it's just in the math. The thing is you look at it from production perspective. For instance, very early on, we were only working in 44 or 48 kilohertz, and then it was, our delivery was always 4416 masters for CD production. But when we're doing the production, like our biggest thing at Sony was, okay, it may be recorded in 4416, but once it's in the computer, and if you just touch it, even with, say you move something by 0.1 decibels, well, immediately what you've done is your computers back then, you're working in 24, your computer processing is 32-bit. Your material has now gone up to 32-bit, and the question is now, is the software you're working in or the hardware that you're working with, is it a fixed point where then that bit would shift and go like this, or was it movable, and so when it would move, it would retain a little bit, it would retain more of the information, and the 32-bit centering would move with your audio. That was a big debate back then, and we found that when you had the capability of floating point, is what we used to call it, when you had that, you were able to get much better results, because then you would be at the final point where it's like, okay, now we have to create our masters, and what are we going to do? Well, right there at the end, we say, all right, we are in 44, but we're working in 24-bit land here. We're going to dither that down properly to then take as much of that information and retain it and redo the math to fit it into 16-bit. Whereas if you don't do that and you're recording and you're doing 16-bit work, or what would happen is as soon as you did something, well, you go like this, and it's like, well, wait, you just moved it. You're not at 24-bit. You don't have that space. So now all of a sudden, you just chopped off all those bits in order to do just a single simple like decibel change or something like that. And the more you do that, the more you're truncating your word length, even though you say, oh, I'm working in 16-bit. It's like, no. You're truncating even further on down the line. And you definitely hear all that processing. Definitely.
Interesting. So it's even when it comes down to when you're doing a lot of editing and all these different things that you're doing with the music. And if you're doing it at that 24-bit, you're losing a lot less than if you'd be doing it at that 16-bit level. Is that?
Yes, correct. It's always working at the higher resolution. Like now, for instance, whenever I set up my projects, we may be recording at whatever sample rate, 24-bit, because that's what the converters are. But my computer DAW software is set for 32-bit already, just so that I'm already capable and thinking, all right, I'm going to be in 32-bit land, because when I do my processing, I want to maximize the complete word length, as large as word length as possible, in order to retain as much of that quality that we captured at the session originally.